They call it a fortress, but it's not built for men. It's built to erase them. You arrive as a name, a face, a memory of home. You leave as a number, if you leave at all. Inside those walls, the Space Marines don't see you. They don't need to. You're already part of the stone. So what happens when you spend your entire life serving gods who will never know you existed? I was 17 when they brought me to the Fortress of Emberwatch, and I believed I had been chosen for something holy. The shuttle ride up from the hive world below had lasted 3 hours, and in that time I had convinced myself that my life was about to gain meaning. I sat among 40 other young men, all of us shaved and scrubbed and silent, our eyes fixed on the iron deck or the scarred walls or nothing at all. We had been selected from the tithes, the best of the forgettable, and we wore simple grey shifts that smelled of disinfectant and fear. I remember thinking that I would serve warriors who strode through legend, men who had been remade into something greater than flesh, and that proximity to their glory would sanctify my existence. I was wrong, but not in the way I expected. The shuttle docked with a sound like a cathedral bell struck by a maul, and when the ramp descended, we were met by a figure in black robes whose face was hidden beneath a hood stitched with litanies in a language I did not recognize. He did not speak our names. He did not welcome us. He gestured once, a sharp motion that might have been a blessing or a dismissal, and we followed him into the fortress. The air that greeted us was cold and tasted of incense and oil and something else, something faintly metallic that lingered at the back of the throat. The walls were stone, massive and ancient, carved with scenes of battle so intricate that I could see the individual teeth in the jaws of dying Xenos, the individual links in chains wrapped around heretics. Somewhere far above us, bells tolled in a rhythm that felt deliberate but incomprehensible. We walked for what felt like an hour, descending through corridors that grew narrower and darker, past alcoves where skulls were stacked in perfect pyramids and where candles burned without ever seeming to diminish. No one spoke. The robed figure led us without looking back, his footsteps silent despite the stone floor, and we followed because there was nothing else to do. I tried to memorize the route, counting turns and doorways, but after the first dozen intersections I gave up. The fortress was not built for human comprehension. It was built to endure. Eventually we arrived in a hall that might have been a chapel or a barracks or both. The ceiling rose into shadow, supported by columns carved to resemble armored giants, and the floor was marked with lines of silver inlay that formed patterns I could not parse. At the far end of the hall stood a lectern of black iron, and behind it waited a man whose face was so gaunt that his skull seemed to press against his skin from the inside. He wore robes of deep crimson, and his hands were augmetic, fingers of brushed steel that clicked softly when he gestured. When he spoke, his voice was dry and precise, each word measured as though it had been weighed before being released. He told us we were now serfs of the chapter, bound in service until death. He told us we would labor in the shadow of the Astartes, performing the 10,000 tasks required to maintain a fortress monastery and the warriors who dwelled within it. He told us that our lives were no longer our own, that we existed now only to serve, and that the Emperor's gaze rested upon us not as individuals, but as instruments. He did not ask if we understood. He did not ask if we consented. He simply told us these things, and then he assigned us to our duties. I was assigned to the Hall of Recollection, a name that meant nothing to me then. My task, as explained by a hunched serf with milky eyes and hands that trembled constantly, was to maintain the reliquaries that lined the hall's eastern wing. I would clean the glass cases that held fragments of bone and armor, polish the brass nameplates beneath them, and ensure that the candles surrounding each display never went out. It sounded simple. It sounded almost peaceful. It was neither. The Hall of Recollection was not a place of rest or contemplation. It was a mausoleum for failures, a gallery of those who had died before becoming what they were meant to be. The reliquaries held the remains of aspirants who had perished during the trials, the surgeries, the conditioning, the 1,000 lethal steps required to transform a human child into an Astartes. Each case contained a fragment, a piece of jawbone still embedded with failed implants, a section of fused ribcage where a progenoid had rejected its host, a shriveled organ suspended in yellowed fluid. Beneath each case was a nameplate, though many were blank, and beneath the nameplate was a single line of High Gothic that I would later learn translated to the same phrase in every instance. He was found wanting. I cleaned these cases every day. I used soft cloth and sanctified oil, working in silence while the bells tolled overhead and the fortress groaned around me like a sleeping beast. The work was meditative in its repetition, and at first I found a kind of peace in it, a sense that I was contributing to something larger than myself. But the peace did not last. The hall was never empty. There were always other serfs performing other tasks, scrubbing the floors or repairing the braziers or replacing the incense cones that smoldered in iron dishes, and none of them ever spoke. They moved through the space like ghosts, their eyes downcast, their movements efficient and joyless. I tried to greet them in those early days, to offer a nod or a smile, but they ignored me so completely that I began to wonder if I had become invisible. The silence grew heavier. I learned the routines quickly because there was no alternative. I woke each day to the sound of bells, the same three-tone sequence that marked the beginning of the labor shift, and I dressed in the same grey shift I had worn since arrival. There was no mirror in my quarters, which I shared with 11 other serfs, all of whom seemed decades older than me despite the fact that some could not have been past their 20s. We slept on narrow cots arranged in 2 rows, and the room smelled of unwashed bodies and the astringent soap we were issued once a month. No one spoke in the mornings. We rose, we dressed, we filed out into the corridor and dispersed to our assigned tasks without acknowledgement or farewell. The Hall of Recollection became my world. I learned its dimensions, its moods, the way the light shifted as the day progressed, and the shadows deepened in the alcoves where the oldest reliquaries were kept. I learned which cases required extra care because the seals were failing, which nameplates had begun to tarnish, which candles burned faster than others and needed to be replaced twice in a single shift. I learned to move quietly, to make myself small, to avoid drawing the attention of the overseers who occasionally passed through the hall in their black robes, inspecting our work with eyes that saw everything and forgave nothing. I saw my first Astartes on the 43rd day. He entered the hall without warning, a figure so large that the doorway seemed to shrink around him. He wore armor the color of dried blood, its surface scarred and pitted from battles I could not imagine, and his helmet was maglocked to his hip, revealing a face that was hard and angular and entirely inhuman. His eyes swept the hall once, a gaze that passed over me and the other serfs as though we were furniture, and then he walked to one of the reliquaries near the center of the hall and stood before it in silence. I froze where I was, cloth in hand, afraid to move and afraid to stay still. The other serfs continued their work as though nothing had changed, their movements uninterrupted, and I forced myself to do the same. I polished the glass case in front of me, my hands shaking slightly, and tried not to stare. The Astartes stood there for perhaps 5 minutes, though it felt longer. He did not touch the reliquary. He did not speak. He simply looked at the fragment of bone inside, at the nameplate beneath it, and then he turned and left the hall as silently as he had entered. The air seemed to decompress after he was gone, and I realized I had been holding my breath. That night, back in the quarters, I tried to speak of it. I turned to the serf in the cot beside mine, a man with a scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw, and I said that I had seen one of the Astartes today, that he had come to the hall and stood before a reliquary. The man did not respond. He did not even look at me. He simply rolled over, his back to me, and within moments his breathing had slowed into the rhythm of sleep. I lay awake for a long time after that, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand what I had done wrong. The months passed, and I began to understand the architecture of the fortress not as a structure but as a doctrine made manifest. Every corridor was a sermon, every chamber a test. The walls were carved with scenes of martyrdom and triumph, the floors inlaid with prayers in languages that predated the Imperium, and the ceilings lost themselves in shadows that might have hidden anything. There were no windows. There was no natural light. Time was measured only by the bells, which tolled in sequences that varied depending on the hour and the holy day and purposes I could not determine. Some days the bells rang constantly, a cacophony that made thought impossible. Other days they were silent, and the silence was worse. I learned that the fortress was divided into regions, each one consecrated to a different aspect of the chapter's identity. There was the Hall of Blades, where the armory was kept, and where tech priests labored over weapons that hummed with barely contained violence. There was the Librarium Sanct, where the chapter's history was recorded in books bound in leather that I suspected was not animal hide. There was the Apothecarian, where the wounded were tended and the dead were harvested for gene seed, and where the screams that echoed through the ventilation shafts were so constant that I learned to sleep through them. And there were places we were forbidden to enter, zones marked with skulls and chains, and warnings in High Gothic that promised death to the unworthy. I never saw what lay beyond those thresholds, but I heard things sometimes, sounds that might have been machinery or voices or something else entirely. My duties expanded slowly. After 6 months I was given additional tasks, assisting in the preparation of ritual oils, helping to transport crates of incense from the storage vaults to the chapels, standing watch over the Hall of Recollection during the night shifts when the other serfs were at rest. The work was endless, and it was never acknowledged. No one praised me. No one corrected me unless I made a mistake, and then the correction was swift and often painful. I learned to anticipate errors before they happened, to move with a precision that bordered on paranoia, to check and recheck every task until my hands ached and my vision blurred. I saw the Astartes more frequently as time went on, though never up close and never for long. They moved through the fortress like storms, sudden and overwhelming and then gone, leaving only the faint smell of ceramite and promethium in their wake. They did not speak to us. They did not acknowledge us. We were part of the infrastructure, as vital and as invisible as the ventilation systems or the gravity plating. I told myself that this was proper, that we existed to serve, and that recognition was not the point, but the lie grew harder to maintain as the years accumulated. I was 23 when I realized I could no longer remember my mother's face. It happened one night in the quarters as I lay on my cot and tried to summon some memory of the hive world I had come from. I could recall the smell of the lower levels, the taste of reclaimed water, the sound of the factorums grinding through their shifts. But when I tried to picture her, the woman who had raised me, I found only a blur. I knew she had existed. I knew she had held me when I was small and had wept when the tithe collectors came, but her features were gone, erased by years of repetition and exhaustion and the relentless sameness of the fortress. I tried to force the memory into focus, to reconstruct her from fragments, but the harder I tried, the more she slipped away. Eventually I gave up, and I lay there in the dark and felt nothing. The fortress endured, and I endured with it. The Chapel of Eternal Vigilance became part of my route in my 5th year. It was a vast space, larger than any cathedral I had seen on the hive world, its ceiling supported by columns that had been carved to resemble the Primarch himself, his face stern and beautiful and inhumanly perfect. The floor was black marble veined with gold, and at the center of the chapel stood an altar of white stone upon which rested a single bolter, its casing engraved with oaths and seals. The bolter had belonged to the chapter master 3,000 years prior, or so I was told by an overseer who spoke only to deliver instructions. My task was to ensure the altar remained clean, the bolter undisturbed, and the candles surrounding it perpetually lit. I performed this task every morning before dawn, which in the fortress meant the hour before the first bell sequence. The chapel was always empty at that time, or nearly so. Sometimes I would see a lone Astartes kneeling before the altar, his armor removed, his head bowed in prayer. I learned to move around these figures as though they were statues, to avoid even the sound of my breath disturbing them. Once, I made the mistake of glancing at the face of a praying Astartes, and his eyes snapped open and fixed on me with such intensity that I felt my legs weaken. He did not speak, he did not move. He simply stared, and I lowered my gaze and backed away, and did not look up again until I was certain he had left. The chapel was also where the aspirants were brought for their final rites before the trials began. I witnessed this ceremony only once, though I would hear of it many times after. A group of boys, none older than 12, were led into the chapel by robed overseers and made to kneel before the altar. They were naked, their heads shaved, their bodies marked with ink that formed prayers and warnings. A chaplain entered, his armor black and adorned with bones and purity seals, his skull-faced helmet a thing of nightmares, and he spoke to them in a voice that resonated through the entire chapel. He told them they were about to be tested, that most of them would die, and that this was the greatest honor they would ever know. He told them that pain was the Emperor's gift, that suffering was the forge in which heroes were made, and that their deaths would serve the Imperium even if their lives could not. The boys did not cry. They did not speak. They simply knelt there, their eyes wide and unblinking, and when the chaplain finished speaking, they were led away into the depths of the fortress, where I was not permitted to follow. I never saw any of them again, but I saw their remains eventually, added to the reliquaries in the Hall of Recollection. The routine was the only stability I had, and I clung to it the way a drowning man clings to debris. I woke to the bells, I performed my tasks, I ate my rations in silence in the communal hall, where hundreds of serfs gathered twice a day to consume bowls of grey paste that tasted of nothing and provided exactly enough nutrition to sustain us. I returned to the quarters, I slept, and I woke again to the bells. Days became weeks, became months, became years, and the only markers of time's passage were the changes in my own body. My hands grew calloused, my back bent slightly from the constant labor, my hair began to thin and grey despite the fact that I was not yet 30. The other serfs aged faster, their bodies breaking down under the weight of the work, and when they could no longer perform their duties, they were taken away and replaced by younger serfs who arrived in the same grey shifts and with the same hollow eyes. I learned not to form attachments. The serf who had slept in the cot beside mine, the man with the scar, disappeared one day and was replaced by a younger man who never spoke and who was himself replaced 2 years later by a woman whose hands shook so badly she could barely hold a polishing cloth. None of them acknowledged me. None of them seemed to want acknowledgement. We existed in parallel, performing our tasks and sharing space but never truly connecting, and after a while I stopped trying. The fortress had rules, though many of them were unspoken. You did not speak unless spoken to. You did not look directly at an Astartes. You did not enter forbidden zones. You did not question your assignments. You did not rest unless your shift had ended. You did not complain. You did not weep. You did not hope for anything beyond survival. These rules were enforced not through violence, though violence was always a possibility, but through a system of silent judgment that permeated every interaction. The overseers watched us constantly, their eyes cold and evaluating, and they seemed to know when someone had stepped out of line even before the infraction occurred. Punishments were swift and varied. Extra shifts, reduced rations, reassignment to the waste reclamation vaults where the air was toxic and the work lethal. I saw serfs vanish for reasons I could not determine, their cots emptied and refilled within hours, and I learned to keep my head down and my movements precise. There were whispers, sometimes, in the moments between shifts when exhaustion made us careless. Whispers of serfs who had tried to escape, who had found their way to the shuttle bays or the loading docks and attempted to leave the fortress. None of these stories ended well. The fortress was not a prison in the traditional sense, but it was inescapable all the same. The exits were guarded, the corridors monitored, and even if one managed to reach a shuttle, there was nowhere to go. We orbited a dead world, a rock scoured of life centuries ago, and the only other presence in the system was the chapter's fleet, which would not have hesitated to annihilate a stolen craft. Escape was not a possibility. It was a fantasy, and fantasies were dangerous. I was 31 when I first entered the Apothecarian. It was not a place serfs were meant to go, but I had been assigned to deliver a crate of medical supplies, sanctified bandages, and vials of stimulants, and other things I did not recognize. The crate was heavy, and I carried it through corridors that grew colder and more sterile as I descended, past doorways that hissed open to reveal surgical theaters where servitors worked on bodies. I tried not to look at too closely. The apothecarium itself was a cathedral of flesh and steel, its walls lined with tanks filled with fluid and shapes that might have been organs or might have been something else. The air smelled of antiseptic and blood and the faint sweetness of decay, and the sounds were worse, a constant background hum of machinery punctuated by wet, organic noises that made my stomach churn. An apothecary met me at the entrance, his armor white and pristine, his gauntlets stained with something dark. He took the crate without a word, his eyes passing over me as though I were a tool he was evaluating for usefulness, and then he turned and carried it deeper into the apothecarium. I stood there for a moment, uncertain whether I had been dismissed, and then I heard a sound that froze me in place. It was a scream, but not a human scream. It was too deep, too resonant, and it carried a note of agony that seemed to vibrate in my chest. I turned and left the apothecarium as quickly as I could, and I did not ask what I had heard. The nightmares started after that. I would wake in the dark, my heart pounding, my mind filled with images of the tanks and the shapes inside them, and the scream that was not human. I tried to push the memories away, to bury them beneath the routine, but they persisted, surfacing at random moments when I was polishing a reliquary or lighting a candle or standing in the communal hall with my bowl of tasteless paste. I began to sleep poorly, and poor sleep led to mistakes, and mistakes led to punishment. I was assigned additional shifts, longer hours, tasks that left my hands bleeding and my back screaming in pain, and I accepted them without complaint because there was nothing else to do. The decades began to blur. I was 43 when I realized I could no longer remember my name. It had been taken from me on the first day, replaced with a designation, a number stenciled onto my shift and spoken by the overseers when they needed to identify me. I had repeated my name to myself in the early years, a private ritual performed in the silence of the quarters, but at some point I had stopped. I could not remember when, I could not remember why, and now, when I tried to recall it, I found only the designation, the number that had become my identity. I stood in the hall of recollection, cloth in hand, and I tried to summon the name my mother had given me, the name I had carried for 17 years before arriving at the fortress, and I could not. It was gone, erased as thoroughly as her face, and I felt nothing. The fortress endured. The seasons did not exist within its walls, but the chapter observed holy days, and on those days the routine shifted. The bells tolled in different sequences, the chapels filled with Astartes in full ceremonial armor, and we serfs were assigned to tasks that supported the rituals. I helped prepare the incense for the feast of the Primarch's Ascension, standing in a chamber filled with braziers, while an overseer recited prayers in High Gothic and directed us to mix powders in precise ratios. I polished the armor of a chaplain before the rite of remembrance, working for 12 hours straight to remove every speck of dust and every fingerprint, my hands cramping and my vision blurring until I could barely see. I stood guard over the Hall of Blades during the Vigil of the Fallen, ensuring that no one disturbed the weapons laid out in tribute to those who had died in the Emperor's service, and I watched as Astartes filed past in silence, each one pausing to touch the hilt of a sword or the barrel of a bolter before moving on. These holy days were the only breaks in the routine, but they were not relief. They were simply a different kind of labor, more intense and more demanding. And when they ended, I returned to my tasks with an exhaustion that went deeper than muscle and bone. I began to notice things that others did not seem to see, or perhaps they saw them and simply accepted them as part of the fortress's nature. The carvings on the walls were not static. They changed, slowly, over the course of years, new details emerging as old ones faded. A battle scene that had once depicted Imperial guardsmen would now show only Astartes. A martyr's face that had been serene would become anguished. I mentioned this once to another serf, a man who had been at the fortress longer than I had, and he looked at me with eyes that were empty and said that the fortress was alive and that it remembered. He did not elaborate, and I did not ask. The Astartes were a constant presence, but they were also utterly remote. I saw them in the corridors, in the chapels, in the training halls where the sound of bolter fire and clashing blades echoed through the stone. I saw them kneeling in prayer, standing in silent vigil, locked in brutal combat during sparring sessions that left the floors cracked and the walls scorched. But I never heard them speak to each other in anything resembling conversation. They communicated through gestures, through vox channels I could not access, through a shared understanding that did not require words. They were brothers, bound by gene seed and purpose, but they were not human. And the distance between us was not merely physical. I was 57 when I saw my first serf executed. He had been assigned to the Librarium Sanct, a role that required him to handle ancient texts and data slates, and he had made a mistake. I did not know what the mistake was. I did not need to know. He was brought to the Chapel of Eternal Vigilance, his hands bound behind his back, his face pale but composed. An overseer read the charges in High Gothic, words I could not fully understand but whose tone was unmistakable. And then a chaplain stepped forward with a bolt pistol. The serf knelt. The chaplain spoke a prayer, short and clipped, and then he fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, and the serf's body collapsed onto the marble floor, his blood pooling around him in a widening circle. Serfs were brought in to clean the mess, their movements efficient and practiced, and within an hour, the chapel looked as though nothing had happened. I thought about that serf for weeks afterward, not because I had known him, but because I had not. He had been a designation, a number, a function, and now he was gone, replaced already by someone else who would perform his tasks until they too failed and were replaced. The fortress did not mourn him. The chapter did not acknowledge his death. He had simply been removed, a flawed component discarded, and the machine continued without interruption. The realization settled over me slowly, a weight that accumulated with each passing year. I was not a person within the fortress. I was a tool, maintained and utilized, and eventually discarded when I broke. My life had no meaning beyond the tasks I performed, and those tasks could be performed by anyone. I was replaceable, forgettable, and the decades I had given to the fortress would leave no mark, no legacy, no memory. When I died, I would be taken away and incinerated, my ashes scattered into the void, and within hours another serf would be sleeping in my cot and wearing my designation. I should have felt despair, but I did not. I felt nothing. The training cages were located in the lower levels, vast chambers where aspirants were put through trials that tested their endurance, their strength, their willingness to endure pain. I was assigned to maintain the cages in my 62nd year, a task that involved cleaning the floors after each session, repairing the chains and manacles that hung from the walls, and ensuring the automated systems functioned correctly. The work was grueling, not because it was physically demanding, but because of what I witnessed. The aspirants were children, most of them between 10 and 14, and they were subjected to horrors that I could barely comprehend. They were beaten, starved, exposed to toxins, forced to fight each other with blades and bare hands. Many of them died. Their bodies were removed by servitors, hauled away to the apothecarian for harvesting, and the cages were hosed down and prepared for the next group. I watched this happen over and over, cycle after cycle, and I became numb to it. The screams no longer affected me. The blood no longer turned my stomach. I cleaned the cages with the same detachment I brought to polishing reliquaries, my mind distant, my hands moving through the motions without thought. The aspirants did not look at me, they did not seem to see me. I was part of the environment, as neutral as the walls or the chains, and my presence did not register. One day, an aspirant spoke to me. He was perhaps 12, his body covered in bruises and cuts, his breathing ragged. He had been chained to the wall for what must have been hours, and when I entered the cage to replace a broken manacle, he turned his head and looked at me with eyes that were still human. He asked me if it got easier. I froze, cloth in hand, and stared at him. No one had asked me a question in years. No one had acknowledged my existence in any way that mattered. I opened my mouth to respond, to tell him something, anything, but the words would not come. I stood there in silence, and after a moment he looked away, and I finished my task and left the cage without speaking. That night, I lay on my cot and thought about the boy's question. Did it get easier? The answer was no. It did not get easier. It simply became normal. The horror faded not because it diminished, but because it became the baseline, the standard against which all other experiences were measured. Pain, death, suffering, these were constants, and the mind adapted by ceasing to register them as exceptional. I had adapted, I had survived, and in doing so, I had lost whatever part of me had once been capable of feeling. The fortress endured, and I endured with it, and the distinction between the two grew harder to discern. The reclusium was a place I visited only rarely, and always with a sense of unease that I could not fully articulate. It was the domain of the chaplains, a vast complex of chapels and meditation cells and chambers filled with relics of the chapter's history. The air there was thick with incense, so dense that it clung to the skin and settled in the lungs, and the walls were covered in scripture written in languages I did not recognize. My task, when I was assigned to the reclusium, was to prepare the censer chains for ritual use, polishing the brass links and filling the censers with fresh incense. The work was simple, but the environment was oppressive, and I always left feeling as though I had been watched by eyes I could not see. It was in the reclusium that I first heard the screaming that did not stop. I was working in one of the side chapels, a small chamber dominated by a statue of the emperor in his aspect as the carrion lord, when I became aware of a sound coming from somewhere below. It was faint at first, barely audible over the chanting that echoed through the reclusium, but as I focused on it, the sound grew clearer. It was a voice, or multiple voices, screaming in unison, and it did not pause for breath. It simply continued, on and on, a sustained note of agony that seemed to have no source and no end. I tried to ignore it, to focus on my work, but the screaming burrowed into my mind and made thought impossible. I left the chapel and returned to my quarters early, my hands shaking, and I did not sleep that night. I asked an overseer about the sound the next day, and he looked at me with an expression I could not read and told me that the reclusium held many things and that some of them were not meant to be understood by those who served. He did not elaborate, and I did not ask again. The years continued to accumulate, each one indistinguishable from the last. I was 73 when I realized I had stopped dreaming. Sleep had become a void, a blank space between shifts, and I would wake with no memory of having rested, only the awareness that time had passed. My body continued to function, but it was breaking down in ways that I could not reverse. My joints ached constantly, my vision had begun to fail, and I coughed blood some mornings, though I told no one. The fortress did not care. My tasks were adjusted to account for my diminishing capacity, shifted to duties that required less physical strength. But I was not retired, not given respite. I would work until I could no longer work, and then I would be discarded. I found myself thinking about the boy in the training cage, the one who had asked if it got easier. I wondered if he had survived the trials, if he had been transformed into an Astartes, if he now walked the corridors of the fortress in armor that weighed more than I did. I wondered if he remembered asking the question, if he remembered me at all. Probably not. I had been invisible even then. The chapel of the last candle became my final assignment. It was a small chamber tucked away in a forgotten corner of the fortress, and it held a single candle that burned atop a stone plinth. The candle was ancient, its wax pale and translucent, and it was said to have been lit by the chapter's founder 10,000 years ago. My task was to ensure it never went out, to sit in the chapel and watch the flame and replace the candle when it burned down to nothing. It was a task given to serfs who were no longer capable of heavier labor, a final duty before the end, and I accepted it without emotion. I sat in the chapel of the last candle for hours each day, watching the flame dance and flicker, and I thought about nothing. The chapel was silent except for the faint hiss of the candle burning, and the silence was absolute, untouched by the bells or the distant sounds of the fortress. Time lost meaning in that silence. I could have been sitting for minutes or hours or days, and I would not have known the difference. The flame became my world, the only point of focus in an existence that had narrowed to a single purpose. One day, an Astartes entered the chapel. I did not hear him approach, but suddenly he was there, standing in the doorway, his armor the color of old stone, his face hidden beneath his helmet. He stood there for a long moment, and then he removed his helmet and looked at me. His face was scarred, his eyes hard and ancient, and when he spoke his voice was low and resonant, like the tolling of a distant bell. He asked me how long I had served. I did not know how to answer. I tried to count the years, to add up the decades, but the numbers slipped away from me. I told him I did not remember. He nodded, as though this was the answer he had expected, and then he told me that service was its own reward, that the Emperor asked nothing of us but our obedience, and that in giving ourselves to the chapter, we became part of something eternal. He spoke these words without emotion, as though reciting a passage from a text, and then he replaced his helmet and left the chapel. I sat there in the silence, the candle burning before me, and I understood that he had not come to comfort me. He had come to remind me of what I was, what I had always been, a tool, a component, a piece of the machine. And the machine did not care if I understood. It only cared that I functioned. The flame flickered. I was 89 when I felt the first tremor in my chest. A sharp pain that spread down my left arm and made my vision blur. I knew what it was. I had seen other serfs collapse from the same cause, their hearts failing under the weight of decades of labor and poor nutrition and unrelenting stress. I did not call for help. I simply sat in the chapel of the last candle, my hand pressed to my chest, and waited to see if this would be the end. The pain faded after a few minutes, leaving me weak and shaking, but alive. I replaced the candle, which had burned low, and I continued my watch. The fortress did not pause. The bells continued to toll. The Astartes continued their endless preparations for wars I would never see, and I sat in the chapel, watching the flame, and waited for the next tremor. It came 2 days later, stronger this time, and I collapsed onto the stone floor, my body convulsing. I could hear footsteps in the corridor outside, the sound of boots on stone, but no one entered the chapel. No one came to help. I lay there, gasping, my vision darkening, and I thought about the boy who had been brought to the fortress at 17, who had believed he was chosen for something holy. I thought about the decades that had followed, the endless repetition, the erasure of identity, the slow dissolution of everything that had once made me human. I thought about the fortress, this monument to endurance and faith and brutality, and I understood that it would outlast me by millennia, that my death would not even register as a footnote in its history. The pain receded again, and I pulled myself upright, my hands trembling. The candle had gone out. I relit it with shaking fingers, using the sanctified matches kept in a brass box beside the plinth, and I watched the flame take hold. The light was small and fragile, but it endured, and I sat there and watched it burn. I do not know how much longer I have. Days, perhaps. Weeks, if I am unlucky. My body is failing in ways I can no longer ignore, and there will come a moment when the pain does not recede, when the darkness does not lift, and I will collapse in this chapel and die alone. My body will be found by another serf, carried away by servitors, incinerated and scattered into the void. My designation will be reassigned. The chapel of the last candle will gain a new watcher, and the fortress will endure. I have given my life to this place, and it has taken everything. My name, my memories, my identity, my humanity. I have been shaped by it, worn down by it, until I am nothing more than a reflection of its purpose. I do not hate it. I do not love it. I simply exist within it, a part of its structure. indistinguishable from the stone and the steel and the endless corridors that lead nowhere. The candle burns, the fortress endures, and I sit here in the silence and wait for the end that I know is coming. There is no peace in this waiting, but there is also no fear. I have been emptied of everything that might allow me to feel either. I am a hollow thing, sustained by routine, held together by the bare minimum of will required to keep the candle lit. When that will fails, when my hands can no longer strike the match or my eyes can no longer see the flame, I will be done and the fortress will not notice. I think sometimes of the Emperor, the figure to whom all of this is dedicated, the god or man or idea that sits at the center of the Imperium and demands the sacrifice of billions. I do not know if he is aware of me, if my service registers in any way within the vast machinery of faith and war that bears his name. I do not know if he cares. The Astartes believe, with a certainty that is absolute, that their suffering honors him, that their death serve him, that their existence is justified by his will. I do not have that certainty. I have only the candle and the flame and the silence. The chapel is cold tonight, colder than usual, and my breath mists in the air. The candle flickers, buffeted by some draft I cannot identify, and I lean forward to shield it with my hand. The flame steadies, and I settle back onto the stone bench that has become my throne and my prison. Outside the chapel, the fortress breathes, its machinery grinding through cycles that have repeated for 10,000 years. Its halls filled with warriors who will never know my name and serfs, who will replace me without thought. I am alone here, but I have been alone for so long that the word has lost its meaning. I wonder, in the moments when my mind drifts, what the boy I was would think if he could see me now. Would he understand? Would he weep? Would he rage against the choice that brought him here? I do not think so. I think he would simply stare, unable to comprehend the distance between who he was and what I have become, and then he would turn away, unwilling to accept that this is his future. But it was always his future. From the moment the tithe collectors chose him, from the moment he stepped onto the shuttle and left the hive world behind, this was the only path available. The fortress does not offer alternatives. It does not provide escapes. It simply exists, and those who enter it are consumed by it, transformed into fuel for a machine that will never stop, never rest, never acknowledge the cost of its endurance. The flame burns lower, and I reach for a new candle from the brass box beside the plinth. My hands are steady, despite the tremor in my chest, and I replace the old candle with practiced efficiency. The flame transfers, guttering for a moment before catching hold, and I set the spent candle aside to be collected later. The ritual soothes me, or perhaps soothing is the wrong word. It occupies me. It gives me something to do, a purpose that fills the emptiness where thoughts used to be. I have stopped counting the days. I have stopped measuring time in any meaningful way. There are only shifts, marked by the bells and the slow progression of candles burning down to nothing. I do not eat unless an overseer brings me rations, which happens less and less frequently. I do not leave the chapel unless I am forced to. I simply sit and watch and wait. The pain comes again, sharper this time, and I double over, my breath hissing through clenched teeth. My vision narrows to a tunnel, the edges darkening, and I can feel my heartbeat stuttering in my chest like a damaged engine trying to turn over. I focus on the flame, using it as an anchor, and I force myself to breathe slowly, evenly, until the pain begins to subside. It takes longer this time, and when it finally releases me, I am left weak and gasping, my body slick with cold sweat. I know this is the beginning of the end. The tremors are coming more frequently, lasting longer, and my body is running out of the reserves it needs to recover. Soon, one of them will not subside, and I will die here, slumped on this bench, my eyes fixed on the flame. It is not a bad way to go, all things considered. Better than the waste reclamation vaults, better than the training cages, better than being executed for some failure I did not understand. The fortress does not care how I die, only that I do not disrupt its function in the process. I hear footsteps in the corridor outside, slow and deliberate, and I turn my head toward the doorway. An overseer enters, his robes black and stiff with age, his face hidden beneath a hood. He looks at me, his eyes pale and unblinking, and then he looks at the candle. He nods, a single sharp motion, and then he leaves without speaking. I do not know what the nod meant. Approval? Acknowledgement? A final benediction? It does not matter. He is gone, and I am alone again. The silence returns, deeper than before, and I settle back onto the bench and watch the flame. It dances and flickers, casting shadows on the walls. And I imagine that the shadows are figures, serfs and astartes and overseers, all of them watching me from the darkness. I know it is not real, that the shadows are just shadows, but the thought comforts me in a way I cannot explain. I have been so alone for so long that even imagined company is better than nothing. The tremor comes again, and this time I do not fight it. I let it wash over me, let the pain spread through my chest and down my arms, let the darkness close in. I can feel my heartbeat slowing, the rhythm becoming irregular, and I know that this is it, that I will not recover from this one. I should feel fear or regret or something, but I feel only a distant curiosity, as though I am watching someone else die and wondering how it will end. The flame is still burning. I can see it, even as my vision darkens, a small point of light in the center of the void. I focus on it, pouring what remains of my will into keeping my eyes open, keeping the flame in sight. It is important, somehow, that I see it until the end, that I do not let the darkness claim me before the light does. My breath comes in shallow gasps now, each one harder than the last, and I can feel my body beginning to shut down, systems failing one by one. My hands are numb, my legs are cold. My thoughts are fragmenting, slipping away like water through a sieve. I try to hold on to something, some memory, some fragment of who I was, but there is nothing left. I have been emptied, hollowed out, and there is only the flame and the silence and the slow dissolution of everything. The light begins to fade, not because the candle is going out, but because my eyes are failing, and I feel a moment of panic, a desperate need to see the flame for just a moment longer. I strain against the darkness, forcing my eyes to stay open, and for a brief instant the flame blazes brighter, sharper, more real than anything I have ever seen. And then it is gone, and I am falling, and the silence swallows me whole. Somewhere, in a forgotten corner of the Fortress of Ember Watch, a serf dies alone in a chapel no one visits. His body is found hours later by another serf, who reports it to an overseer, who dispatches servitors to collect the remains. The body is taken to the incinerators, reduced to ash, and scattered into the void. The chapel of the last candle is cleaned, the spent candle replaced, and a new serf is assigned to watch the flame. The fortress endures. The candle burns. And the Imperium, vast and indifferent, continues its endless war against the dying of the light.